what inspired you to establish the foundation in the first place in 2000 with Bill?
Well, it was really the first trip to Africa that Bill and I took. We took together, and we went really for a safari, which we had a lovely time and fell in love with the animals in the savannah. But it was really the people. We came back inspired by the people, and we started to ask ourselves some questions about why is it that people can grow up in a certain way in the United States or in China or in Europe, but they can't grow up that way in Africa. And what is it that a foundation could do about that to help people live a healthy and ultimately a prosperous and productive life? And it was that trip that started us on our journey.
So that's the trip, and that's from Africa. But now the foundation is quite global. So there are so many issues, challenges that need our attention. What makes you decide which to prioritize your foundation?
Well, we look at where the biggest, what we call death and disability happen in the world, and that's where we focus, because if you can start with a healthy life, you then have the chance to lift yourself out of poverty. You then can grow the right things, hopefully on your farm. With fintech, you can hopefully start to save a few yuan on your phone. But if you don't start with a healthy life, you can't go on to get a great education or to get a great job. So we look at the biggest diseases: HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and that's where we really focus the most. And but we focus globally because those issues, diseases cross borders. We know that today. They don't know any borders, and they also affect different people at different rates in different places.
And global health is one of your focus. It spent $32 billion US dollars. That's a lot of money. So that capital you pour into the global health and development has a great results. But I guess there might be some failures. So in the process, so how does these failures help you to make future decisions?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing that's important to understand about philanthropy is that all philanthropy can do is be what we call a catalytic wedge. It can take pilot projects, it can take risks where sometimes a government can't or won't take a risk, it can shine light and move things forward. But everything we do at the foundation takes government money, huge government money, to scale it up. Even what looks enormous, 32 billion, that's nothing if you want to really tackle HIV/AIDS around the world or malaria. But absolutely, we are willing to take risks, and so we get failures. So if you'd asked Bill or me 10 years ago, would we have an HIV/AIDS vaccine by now, we would have said yes, and we don't. But that failure on the HIV/AIDS vaccine made us realize that we shouldn't, as we were investing with others in these individual candidates, we had to learn from every single candidate that was invested in and have a whole pool in a database where all that research was poured into so we could learn from each of those failures, and all the scientists around the globe could learn from the various failures that happen. So we've learned to share a lot of data and information, whether we have a success or a failure, because that's how you move things forward.
Just now you mentioned about the government. I guess that the Gates Foundation must leverage other resources like the government, like other private sectors. Can you give us an example of how you leverage other resources to help you to push forward your agenda?
Sure, absolutely. Every single thing that we do is in partnership with civil society and a government. We do not have enough, we don't have staff on the ground all over the world. So probably the best example I can give you is a public-private partnership that we helped start called the Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization. It's a huge pool of money that's private and public, mostly public. And because of that pool of money, we can go to vaccine manufacturers and say, work on diseases of the poor world, where there wouldn't normally be a vaccine market there. There's this pool of money that can pull the vaccines through. They know, hey, there's actually funding for these vaccines. So then they'll work on an HIV/AIDS vaccine or a malaria vaccine where there was no incentive before. And so that's just one example of how government funding will ultimately, it does buy hundreds of millions of vaccines that vaccine fund has purchased. And now there are over 6 million children alive because of that partnership.
That's fabulous. So the Gates Foundation is quite unique around the globe. So how do you and Bill contribute to those uniqueness?
Well, I think it's the both the optimistic nature we have. We see where the world is going, and this ability, this belief that you have to constantly learn and constantly change, and that it's this belief in the innovations that have come and are coming along, and how do we apply those innovations in ways that can serve everyone, not just the high end of society, but absolutely everyone. So a perfect example is the mobile phone, right? There's still a pretty big gap between poor women in remote rural areas getting mobile phones. We need to make sure that mobile phones are ubiquitous and everybody gets them, because again, when a woman can get that money in her hands, if her husband gets a job and can send some yuan home, or she gets a few yuan that she's saving off of her farm, she then has her own account and her own money. And when you get money in the hands of women, it changes everything inside of her family.
True.
And so I think that's just one way that we try to take these innovations and make sure that they're spread equally for everybody.
I'm quite interested in the optimism you have. You always say that you are impatient optimism, but facing with a lot of world problems like the gap between the rich and poor, the terrorism, the slowing down of the world economy, a lot of people tend to be very pessimistic. But why so? Why are you so optimistic?
Well, I think sometimes we take the short-term crises and we highlight those on the news instead of looking at the long-term perspective. If you look at violence around the world, yes, there are some horrific places that are still violent in the world. But if you look at the long arc of history, the world is far less violent than it's ever been. If you look back and you say, since 1990, we've cut in half the number of children that die every year. We've cut it in half. Or you say in China, 700 million people have been lifted out of poverty. Yes, there are still 40 million to go, but 40 versus 700, that's a pretty phenomenal number. And so Bill and I look at that progress, and we're always asking ourselves, how do you take the lessons from that progress and how do you accelerate it on behalf of the world? And when I go out and visit families in these remote rural areas where they're not facing a disease that maybe somebody would have faced 20 years ago, or they're not getting as many episodes of malaria in their family, and they'll tell you the difference it makes, that makes me very optimistic about the world.
The Gates Foundation has achieved a lot of things, and is due to the partnership between you and Bill. A lot of people say that it's very hard for the couples to work under the same organization. So how do you manage to do that?
Yeah, well, sure, couples don't agree on everything, right? But I think that Bill and I have big goals that are shared goals, and we recommit ourselves to those big long-term goals, and we're both very ambitious about those goals. And so yes, we can disagree about some specifics sometimes, but what we always agree to do is to disagree in private, and then when we show up at the office, we are showed up as a unified couple. And as long as we have our sights on the long-term goals, it makes the small disagreements, to be honest, even smaller.
So you did have some major arguments?
We've certainly had disagreements, you bet. But they're always with the intent of, are we doing the most for the world? Are we doing the very best with these resources that we have from Microsoft and that Warren Buffett has given to our foundation? Are we doing the very best with those resources? And so the disagreements are more about how much do we spend on a particular project this year versus waiting for the long-term solution. And those are nuances, and they're important to work out though. But again, it's always with that long-term goal in mind.
But what about in life? Just now you mentioned about the work, but what about in life? How do you keep the balance at home with Bill?
Sure. Well, I mean, we both, of course, again, we love each other, right? And we have a lot of respect for each other. We're raising 3 kids. So is it easy every single day? No. But, you know, for the most part, we agree on things. Sure, there are sometimes tensions around time, right? Time is our scarcest resource. So if I feel Bill is traveling too much, or he feels like maybe I'm not taking the right number of meetings, or I'm traveling too much, we can disagree about that. But we always try to step back and look at our calendar as a whole, because it helps us drive our family forward in our goals and what we want to do.
It is said that Bill talked a lot about science during your dating time. Is that true?
Sure. Bill loves science, but I like to listen. And we both read a lot, and sometimes on vacations quite often we'll be reading different books, but then every few chapters we'll explain it to the other person. And for me, one of the things I love is that Bill has always said that if you are really learning something deeply, you don't know if you know it until you can teach it to someone else.
Yeah.
And Bill's a really good teacher, so I learn a lot of science by what Bill reads and explains to me, and he learns a lot about the world through what I read, but also the trips I take where I'm out in a remote rural area and I come back and tell him this is what I've heard from women, and he listens very deeply as well.
So what interests you most? What kind of subject? Like the women's subject? Or?
For reading or for my work? Oh, for reading, I love to read cultural fiction because I feel like I really learn deeply about a place if you're reading the fiction of that place. So quite often if I'm, say for instance in India, I'll be reading cultural fiction about India or cultural fiction if I'm in Africa.
How does those books, both what you read and what Bill's read, help you to build the foundation?
Oh, I think it helps us have huge perspective because any of these scientific innovations that we are trying to move and push forward for the world, you have to remember you can have the very best science tool, but if a woman won't accept putting those polio drops in her child's mouth or that vaccine in her child's arm or in her arm, that best science is going to sit on the shelf. And so understanding the cultural perspective and how do you work with civil society and with parents in a culture so that they choose to take these tools up, that's vitally important. And so we both come at it from these two angles and merge them together, and I think that helps benefit the work and move it forward.
Now here you are in China, and we all very welcome you here. What's your biggest challenge to do your foundation work here?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a challenge. I would say the biggest thing about working in China is making sure that we're supporting China's goals. So President Xi Jinping has this huge goal for poverty alleviation. He talks very passionately about it. He did with Bill and me when he was in Seattle in 2015. And we want to support that work and in addition take those lessons and have China export those lessons to around the world. So everything that China has learned about malaria eradication, where there used to be 60 million cases a year of malaria in China, now there's a few thousand, that amazing research and development and also the tactics of how you do a real malaria elimination, we want to make sure those lessons are actually moved to China or moved to Africa. Or the amazing things that China has done in agriculture to feed, China has 10% of the arable land in the world and yet they feed 25% of the world's population. So how do you take those lessons of agriculture and bring those to Africa as well? So I think China has a lot to give to the world in terms of expertise, and so we want to help further that with the Chinese government.
So what you have done in China and what you are going to do in China will have play a role in your global strategy of the foundation.
Sure. So when Bill was here in March, he signed an MOU with CPAD around poverty alleviation. I signed an MOU yesterday also with NHFPC, and it's around China's poverty alleviation goals. And so we are working specifically on primary health care in some of the most remote rural places here where these 40 million people still live in poverty, but particularly working on young children's nutrition. 10% of the population here is still stunted. And also working on that primary health care facility, that place that a mom or dad first takes their child for all the important things that they need, from vaccines to nutrition to other services. So we're going to work with the government on those pieces, and then as well work with China on their amazing R&D around all kinds of drugs and vaccines for global health around the world.
Wow, you have a lot of things to do in China. So let's talk back to the US. What do you think the populism now prevails in US and in part of Europe? Why do you think suddenly all of the institutions cannot convince the people? They used to convince them.
Well, I think things have changed around the globe, and I think people need time to catch up with what has gone on around the world. Diseases are crossing border. People are leaving Africa and moving to Europe. And so I think you're seeing a restlessness among people about what's really going on with the technological change. And I think the most important message that we can give is that this foreign aid that has been given by the United States and by Europe and Japan, and now China's contributing a little bit to that as well. South Korea is a huge foreign aid donor partner now. That foreign aid helps develop economies like Africa, countries in Africa. And that if people have health and prosperity where they are and they can get a great job, they're going to stay there. And so if we want a peaceful and prosperous world, we need to invest in foreign aid. And so Bill and I now spend a lot of time advocating on behalf of foreign aid, not just to the US government, but also to European governments, to Japan, to South Korea, and even to China over time. Again, this amazing R&D that China has, exporting that on behalf of the world is going to benefit all of humankind.
Thank you so much again, Melinda.
Thanks for your time.
In 2006, Warren Buffett announced to donate like 85% of its Berkshire Hathaway stocks to 5 different foundations, and most of that grants goes to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Tell you the decision before the announcement, and was that a surprise to you?
Well, I'd been good friends with Warren Buffett for a number of years, and he had given me advice about the foundation work. I was very excited about what we were doing, but his wife, Susie, was going to be in charge of giving away the money that he made. Tragically, she died, and so a few months after that, Warren said to us that he thought the most logical thing would be to make a major gift to our foundation. And it's the biggest gift anyone's given to anyone else's foundation. So it was quite stunning, even though we were close friends. And we were honored. You know, it made us think, okay, we can be more ambitious. Warren told us to go out and take risk. And so now that's 10 years ago, and Warren thought it'd be great if we wrote to him about how we see the overall impact of the most generous act ever made.
So during this 10 years, how do you report to Warren or discuss with him about all the development of the foundation annually?
Well, we get to see Warren a lot, and he's a trustee, so we're coming together. But this is stepping back and saying, what did we expect at the time? What's gone better than we expected? And just the discipline going through this writing. And there's lots of people like Warren who care about the poorest, but they don't get to fly to Africa like we do. They don't get to meet with the top scientists and see what's realistic. In fact, we mentioned in the letter that less than 1% of the world correctly answers the question of what's happened to poverty over the last 25 years, which is that it's been more than cut in half. And as they see the pictures on the screen of tough situation, people think actually that things got worse. It's too bad. We need to bring the good news and explain what went well and how we can do even more of it.
And that's a big achievement for the foundation, and you are quite proud of it. And I noticed that actually most of its grants goes to either both the Global Health Program and the Global Development Program. But do you have any plan to maybe adjust the portfolio in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, our foundation's biggest effort is to make sure that the health of the poorest is not worse than the rest of the world, that a child everywhere has the same chance of surviving and having the nutrition so they can develop their physical and mental potential. And we're still far short of that. Over 6 million kids a year are still dying before the age of 5, 1 million in the very first day of life. And so for my lifetime and Melinda's, getting rid of these diseases, malaria, TB, HIV, that'll remain our primary focus. We want to end those diseases. The only one that's close to being ended is the polio disease, which paralyzes children.
But you have to spend over $4 billion on average every year. Like, is that a burden to you? What if there's no good deal for a year?
Well, certainly getting great vaccines out, helping to invent a vaccine for, say, HIV, those are unbelievable things, because as soon as you have that vaccine, you'll be saving millions of lives a year. So these global health investments we're making are really phenomenal. You know, it's like investing in a, Microsoft or Google. The returns are even higher in terms of the improving the human condition. The poorest, we often don't invest for them because there's not a market, and yet their needs are quite significant. And so we're going to stay focused on solving these health problems, and during our lifetime, we think we can largely solve them.
And because you have done a philosophy for such a long years, have you ever think about to change the way to do it? Because Max Dagworth think about the other way. He chose the LLC structure. Have you ever think about to change the foundation structure into more like flexible way?
Well, that's kind of a complicated topic. There's many ways you can structure things. We use a foundation structure. The country's tax laws and ways they encourage philanthropy, I mean, there will be some variety there. At the end of the day, if you want to help the poor, you need to give grants. You need to give money so that those vaccines can get to them. Now, sometimes you'll have a product that, like an HIV vaccine, where it'll be used both in countries that can afford to pay for it and in countries that can't. And so you want to make sure you get private companies in to help you with that part where they do see the customers and you get their unique skills. So how you tap into the private sector, we're always looking and being creative about that because in many areas, including making new vaccines, that's where a lot of the expertise is.
So the structure of the foundation nowadays, you think, helps you to achieve the charitable goals you guys set?
Certainly, we use a lot of approaches, mostly grants, but some investments to help the companies doing those new tools. Including in China, we're always looking for companies that might have products that can have those uses.
I mean, you have different roles beyond the co-chair of this foundation. How do you manage your time? How much time you can spend in this foundation?
My full-time work is the work with my wife, Melinda, on the foundation. I'm an advisor to Microsoft on some of their advanced technology. I enjoy that. That's maybe 15% of my time. I'm working in some energy areas, including breakthrough fourth-generation nuclear power company called TerraPower. I think the energy space is very important because of climate change. But the biggest thing is this foundation work. I'm getting out to all the partners, to Africa, to India, to see the impact of these big grants we're making and understand what's still needed.
So how those like field trip to South Africa change your views in life and the world, change your view to do the philanthropy?
Well, for example, when I was in South Africa for the big AIDS conference last year, it was to understand why our current tools that help women prevent getting HIV infection, why they weren't using them. What was it about their side effects or the daily usage or the stigma? And therefore how we could change those tools and drop that infection rate. So, I went out and met with lots of girls in these township families, and they talked to me about what choices they'd made and what kind of product changes might be attractive to them. And so the scientific agenda's got to be informed about what users are willing to do, how tough it is to get things delivered. And so it's that field work informs all the grants we're making.
In the annual letter, you also told us a story like you get the permission of a baby's autopsy from his parents. How do you feel at that time?
Well, I think it's awful that we don't know more about why young children die. In very rich countries, we do lots of investigation about death. But in the poor countries where over 90% of the our children deaths are, we don't investigate. So knowing what kind of infection we might have been able to prevent, we don't have that data. And people always said it would be too expensive and the mothers would never agree. So we had to design, using the latest tools, a very inexpensive way to do it called minimally invasive autopsy. And then we went out and asked parents, could we look and see so that maybe in the future, in a similar situation, the child wouldn't die. And we got, surprisingly, very high acceptance to that. And so I, in the letter, talk about an autopsy where I actually was present to see and to figure out why this child had stopped breathing because that was so sad for the mother.
Yeah, but it helps the science to get to know the data. It could help more people in the poor country.
Right, which is why the mother agreed that we should investigate.
And I think political weather is another challenge for nowadays, especially, I mean, financial crisis, populism rising. How do you face the new normal if the country were just cut the more foreign aids in the future?
Well, fortunately, a lot of countries participate in foreign aid, and the good news is a lot of countries that needed foreign aid have developed, and the pace of development is very good. South Korea, as late as the 1970s, received foreign aid. Now they're a foreign aid donor. China today doesn't receive foreign aid and is starting to be a foreign aid giver. And so we get to concentrate. We have more givers and less recipients. And so some of these countries, like in landlocked Africa, very tough challenge, but we now have more resources to help them. We have better science. The success stories of how that aid is having such success, we need to get that out there so that voters don't think of it that's money that's wasted or feel like it has no impact at all. And using this digital world and getting out and telling taxpayers to be proud of that kind of outreach, we need to keep doing that because there's a lot of fiscal priorities. Budgets are particularly tight, but I don't think foreign aid will go down a lot. It may not go up a lot, so we'll have to use what we have along with the new science to have even more impact.
How will you use the endowments from your family and the contribution from Warren Buffett in a more sustainable way?
Well, if you can do something like eradicate polio, then forever after, nobody has to buy the vaccine or deal with the paralyzed child. It's gone, just like smallpox is gone, and we don't spend money on that. People don't have those pockmarked complexions now because it's completely a thing of the past. So if you can uplift a country so that its health is good, then its kids can learn. And over time, it develops the structures and resources to be self-sufficient. The goal is always to have countries graduate so we can then focus on the remainder and eventually get all countries to be self-sufficient. So that's the sustainability, is getting them out of their poverty trap, and in some cases completely getting rid of the disease, and so nothing has to be spent on it.
How far away from our get rid of all the epidemic flus, let's say Ebola or Zika virus, what can we do now to contain the damage in the future?
Well, when we have new diseases come along, it takes us a long time to create a new vaccine. So there's some new approaches that far more rapidly you might be able to get the vaccine. If you could do it literally in weeks, then that would become a key tool to stop a flu epidemic or a big Ebola epidemic. Unless we tap into that science, we're very much at risk of a certain type of flu that we haven't seen a really bad one since 1917. But because people travel so much, the speed of infection would be even higher. People have done movies about this. I did a TED Talk about this. We're not as ready as we should be. And because it's a global problem, it's kind of like climate change, where you need the top governments to work together. You need China and the US and Europe all thinking, okay, let's get our scientists, let's get our manufacturing capacity. And if this came about, we'd have to coordinate a lot of our activity through WHO and by working with each other. And there is more dialogue about that. Even though Ebola and Zika were a tragedy, it's reminding people that whether it's flu or MERS or some unknown thing, governments haven't stepped up enough. And yet there's some science that should make it, if we do the right thing in the next 5 or 10 years, we would be far more prepared.
In terms of the technology, you mentioned energy before. Is there any other area you're going to bet? Because you made a bet, like many things going to change by 2030. So in terms of technology, which technology are you going to bet which could make a biggest change for the next 5 or 10 years for the poll?
Well, I work in the foundation where making vaccines easier and better, that'll be a top priority for us because malaria, TB, HIV, we need phenomenal vaccines for those. Microsoft, of course, is using AI to do magical digital things. And then in the energy space, we have a lot of paths, including a way of storing energy that's more inexpensive, but that's very hard to do. Making nuclear cheaper and safer with this 4th generation. So multiple ideas with the goal that we want energy that's less expensive and has none of these either local pollutants or the global pollutants, which are the greenhouse gases.